Hi, and welcome to fleetmusic.blogspot.com. This is my first posting, and with that in mind, I wanted to offer up a few words of introduction about the blog. This blog is about the production of electronic music, predominantly techno and house, and using Ableton Live exclusively for that. In particular, I'll be using Ableton's built-in effects and synths. There'll be a big emphasis on synthesis as opposed to the use of samples and loops. Um, the reason being that this is essentially the way I work and a way that I find creativity quite interesting. And this in conjunction with the constraint that I impose upon myself of only using Ableton's built-in synths and effects, it really avoids that tyranny of choice situation that I've found myself in, whereby you're loading God knows how many synths and VSTs into your project, and instead of actually focusing on learning the set, Ableton synths, which are very versatile and very effective, and actually allow you to get to the end results and to the finished product much quicker. The reasons for actually starting this blog, I guess, are twofold. One, I guess, is altruistic. I've spent a lot of time watching internet videos and reading people's blogs and learning stuff from people who've spent their time providing that content, and so I kind of felt I wanted to give something back. And two, I guess it's slightly selfish. Like I'm sure a lot of you only get a certain amount of time in my week to spend on music, and the idea of starting this blog is to kind of make the time that I have slightly more focused by producing these blog postings and tutorial videos. In addition to the emphasis on synthesis, I want this blog to have a critical edge, a kind of critical aspect to it. That's not to be confused with something that's going to be negative or bitchy, but I want to focus on artists in the contemporary music scene who I find interesting and examine their work, or see um, how the synthesis and how the sound design aspects that I'll be looking on reflect and correlate to what's happening in the wider world. Anyway, let's go on with the first tutorial. Um, this first tutorial is going to be a really simple sound design tutorial, and we're going to be looking at the most basic of element, the kick drum, really. Um, and then as you all probably know, that whether knowingly or not, really, the kick has kind of three components. Typically, in sample-based production methods, you'd achieve a kick through the layering up of sounds, and that's a completely obviously good and very effective way, and thousands of people use that. As I've just stated, the emphasis in this blog is on synthesis, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to synthesize three kicks, and so as I briefly mentioned, there's a kind of three components to the sound. You've got on the upper end you have the click, which is, well, roughly all the content above 1 kilohertz, and then in the middle you have the body, so the body of the sound, the body of the kick, and that ranges from 100 hertz up to 1 kilohertz, and below that you have the sub, the kind of throb of the kick. And so with that in mind, and with that little description over, we're just going to crack on. The first kick is going to be a really simple one oscillator kick. But before we do anything, I'm just going to drag a limiter over onto the master channel just to catch any unwanted peaks, just in case. And that's a really good thing to do, whatever you're doing, whether you're just making a loop or working on one sound. It will stop you wrecking your ears and wrecking your speakers. So we're going to hit return and chuck a instance of operator into our first MIDI channel. So this first kick is really just going to be the degree zero of kick drums. It's just going to be one oscillator kick. So I've already turned off oscillators B, C, and D. And now I'm going to go insert a clip. I'm going to go way down to C1. I'm going to pull out the loop braces, so we're just looping a 4/4 kick. Fire that off. Here you can hear our basic tone, C1. So the first step we're going to do here is some envelope shaping. And we're going to dial in some settings that you'd expect typically for any kind of percussive sound, just as a starting point. So I pull down the sustain to -infinite, i.e. no no sustain whatsoever, and then dial in a very short attack of about 200 milliseconds. I'm going to increase the volume a little bit because I can see from this meter here and obviously this meter here that we have headroom, so I'm not expecting to use that all up, so I'm just going to lift it a little bit more. As you can hear, it's a pretty weak kick, not much going on there. So the next step we're going to do is use the pitch envelope. So turning it on by clicking that button there, and then we're going to dial up to 100%, and then we're going to dial in some initial settings. So put up the peak to something sensible. Go by ear. There's no, well, there are fixed rules, but there's nothing wrong with working out things as you go along. I'm going to shorten the decay, and you hear the instant effect of going from the default value down to something shorter. So here we're about 50 milliseconds. And if we get rid of that attack that I dialed in, you hear that snap, you hear that transient coming through. And let's just experiment here by increasing the peak setting slightly. So it's got a real snap to it. I mean, I would say it's maybe a little too much for our purposes here, and so what I'm going to do, I'm going to pull back on the wet dry. And here, you know, to my ears that sounds okay. We've got a bit of the thud, not much, admittedly, and we have that kind of snap up top. So that's our basic, very, very simple one oscillator kick. So I'm just going to select our instance of operator and group it up, and then I'm going to make some very, very simple macro mappings. So the first thing I'm going to do is map the decay to macro 1. I'm going to dial in a sensible minimum amount of 150, and our max I think we'll go for 300. So quickly let's have a listen to that. So that's, you know, we can see we've got a sensible range of variation there. Let's just leave that around 200. The next mapping, we're going to right click on sustain, or the sustain value, and assign that to macro 2. And by what we're doing here, obviously what you can hear, as we're putting up the value of sustain, we're getting a bit more weight to the sound. Obviously having it at 0 dB is pretty awful, so with that in mind we're going to pull the maximum value. Bear with me. We're just going to pull down the max value till it sounds okay as a max. Let's roll that back a bit. So that's got a bit more weight to it than it had previously. And our third and final step is going to be to right click on that dial, on the pitch envelope dial, and assign that to macro 3. For minimum value, we're going to click in that field, minimum value field, enter in 0. Exit map mode by clicking on the green button here, and then we're just going to dial in the setting. So okay, that's our first kick, which was our simple one oscillator kick. I'm just going to Apple R and rename this. I'm going to stop that clip, turn that off. Now I'm going to pull in another instance of operator, and that's going to give us another MIDI channel with an instance of operator in that. This next kick is going to make use of some FM synthesis. Later down the line I'll maybe do a kind of more exhaustive explanation of FM, but at the moment let's just get moving. We only need one voice. Let's trigger off that clip. So here we go, we've got our C1. What I'm going to do here, and this is one of the great reasons, or one of the main reasons for actually synthesizing your kicks as opposed to just layering up samples or using sample kicks, is that you can change the pitch of the kick to reflect the key of the track that you're working in or on. So here now we're going down to G0, which is a nice resonant note. We're going to not do that. We're going to turn oscillator on, oscillator A back on, dial in those simple decay settings and sustain settings like we did previously. And here comes the FM bit. So now we're going to get oscillator B, dial in initial setting for that. What we've done to the core setting, we've taken it down to 0.5, which effectively means you're modulating oscillator A with a sine wave 1 octave below the octave of oscillator A. Hope that's not too confusing. And you can hear it's giving us a bit more growl. Let's up the volume a bit. The third oscillator, oscillator C, we're going to use to actually give us that click. And so we're going to dial in a very short decay and no sustain for this sound. And we're going to take the core settings up to 7. So that's going to be 6 octaves above the tone of oscillator A. And just increasing the level is going to increase the effect of the modulation. So it's instantly sounding quite percussive and they're quite woody. We don't really maybe want that. Don't want that to such an extent. So what we're going to do, we're going to shorten the decay, and now we've just got that kind of snap rather than anything any longer kind of tone in the sound. I might do what we did previously and give us a bit of sustain. So here you go, that's our FM kick. And so as we did previously, we're going to select the operator even. I'm going to hit Command G and we're going to do some basic mappings. I'm going to map sustain to macro 1. And I'm going to map the level, i.e. how much oscillator B affects oscillator A, to oscillator to macro B, macro 2 even. With FM, a little goes a long way, so we really don't want that, as you can hear, but the subtle modulations of the sound really help to distinguish and differentiate it. And our last mapping is going to be the level of oscillator C, which is very self-explanatory. We go from having no kind of upper end to the sound to introducing a nice kind of attack transient. And there we go. That is our second kick. I'm just going to call that FM kick. And you're going to have to join me in part 2 for our third and final kick. So yeah, thank you. I'll see you for part 2.